Here today to talk about maintaining effective communication, Lisa Christian, who's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry. And she does work on stress and health and pregnancy and the effects of psychological stress on the immune function. And she also is one of the co-teachers for the mentor training that we offer through the CCTS a couple of times a year. So keep a lookout for that if you're interested. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa. And you should be getting a handout, by the way, so keep a lookout for that.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me here today. As Stuart mentioned, I co-lead sessions on mentoring workshops with Carla Zadnik. We offer them about twice a year, and I see a few faces here. Have some people already attended the mentoring workshops? I thought, yeah, a few people have. So some of this will kind of be repeat content, but every time we lead these, new discussions and new things come out, because the way we lead the mentoring workshops, and feel free to talk to folks who have attended them in the past, is it's very much based on group discussion. We're really eliciting the collective wisdom of the group, and they're always really interesting discussions that occur. The mentor workshops include faculty all the way from, well, really the postdoc level, all the way through senior faculty. And so we get people with a lot of different perspectives, both from their roles as mentees and their roles as mentors, because we've all been in both positions throughout our careers. And so I really encourage you to check those out. We offer them once or twice a year. They are usually from about 2 to 5 p.m. on 2 Wednesdays or 2 Thursdays, 2 weeks in a row. And they cover a variety of different topics, and maintaining effective communication is one of them. So a couple of the activities we'll do today give you a sampling of the type of how that programming looks. So to begin with, hopefully you've all received this handout, and I'll go ahead and read through it with you. So this is giving constructive feedback. As he leaves the crowded conference room, Dr. Tariq tells Dr. Timms he'll see her in a few minutes. Dr. Timms was the last presenter in the practice session. Back in his office, Dr. Tariq sits looking distractedly out the window and releases a heavy sigh. He shifts his attention back to his notes for a last review. Reading the slides too fast, too long, print too small, too much print, color contrast, meandering. A few minutes later, he hears a knock on the door and beckons Dr. Timms to come in. She plops in a chair across from him and looks up expectantly. He meets her gaze and smiles. Thanks for coming by. I want to make sure we could review your talk since the conference is in a week, and I know you're in clinic all day tomorrow, and then I'm out of town, he says with a heavy accent. Dr. Timms continues to stare without comment, a blank expression on her face. Well, as you know, I think your research is really important, and I'm glad that we have this opportunity to share it. I think this conference will be a great opportunity for you to meet some key colleagues in this field. She nods slightly and shifts in her seat. I do think there are a few things that could tighten up your presentation. She continues to stare, and Dr. Tariq keeps his focus on his notes as he continues. For example, you have some long sentences and even whole paragraphs on your slides. While they are well written, his computer chimes and a new email arrives, and he glances over to see who it's from. Oh no, not again. As I was saying, well, while they were well written, I mean, you know your writing is strong. It is really too much text for a slide. You could try to shorten up some bullet points. Then you can still make those points without just reading your slides to the audience. He looks up a bit and sees that she's now looking at the floor. It would allow you to increase the font size a bit. I think it might have been hard to read from the back of the room. He looks up and sees she is taking some notes. To cut back on time, I think you could cut the 4 slides on the background and just briefly summarize those. He waits for comment, and the silence drags on a few moments. What do you think? I can look at it. Her face remains expressionless as she glances up and briefly meets his eye. That might allow you to slow down a bit, he continues. Of course, it's natural to get nervous, and then one tends to talk faster. Perhaps you could practice it a bit at home and focus on slowing the pace and not looking at your notes so much. Have you tried practicing out loud to yourself at home? Yes. The phone rings. He checks his caller ID. I'll have to call her back when this is over. Okay then. I can help you I can send you a link on some tips on slide composition and oral presentation. Hopefully that will be helpful. There's another long moment of silence. Well, do you have any questions for me? No, not right now. Okay then, good luck. He forces another smile and reaches out to shake her hand as she rises to leave. She takes it and smiles feebly. Thanks. Okay. So was this an example? This was clearly an example of really effective communication, right? So generally, I have like a white erase board, but in the absence of that, I will add your comments to here. So using this specific example, or just using this as kind of a launching point to think about communication in general, what do you think are some aspects, some hallmarks of effective communication versus ineffective communication. What are some things that you saw here? Yes?
You should have asked her to reflect on it and think about what she thinks it went well, what didn't go well.
So start by ask her first, right? So elicit feedback first. So elicit feedback from the person to see if you're on the same page, or to see if that person maybe has other concerns that maybe that person didn't bring up, or maybe that person has blind spots and doesn't notice some of the things that are problematic. Other things, good or bad. Yes?
Check in for understanding, make sure she was making eye contact and engaging.
Okay, so check in for understanding. And what if you get a response, you check in and you get a response like, sure, yes, okay. What do you do with that?
Maybe ask her to make a bullet point out of a sentence.
Okay, so ask her to make a bullet point out of a sentence. So if you're bringing up a point and she says, sure, then try to actually do something, a task right there in person. So work together in person on what you're talking about so that you have this hands-on aspect going on. Other things, good or bad? Yes?
I think it would have been important to avoid distractions to make it
Right. So that was an obvious one. They threw that in there a lot with the dinging and the binging and yeah. So it sends a message that you're not my primary priority, you're not perhaps 100% important, I'm not giving you my undivided attention. So that is a really clear one that stands out in this particular example. Yes?
I heard somewhere that for every one negative feedback,
Yes?
person who should provide 6 positive.
Wow. 6 positives for every negative. That's a new one. I haven't heard that one in particular. Have other people heard of that sort of a ratio? You've heard 6 to 1? 5 to 1? Wow. Okay. Do you apply that in your own mentoring practice? Have other people tried to do that? That's somewhat similar to the idea of the sandwich technique. Has everyone heard of the sandwich technique? So the sandwich technique is the idea that you give a positive before you give maybe some negative critical feedback, and then you end on a positive note to kind of sandwich the negative in the middle. So what sort of situations would that sort of a technique be helpful, do you think? Yes? Yearly reviews? Is there a reason that sort of setting in particular would be helpful? Okay. What if the person is really doing incredibly poorly in their yearly review and you have some bad, you really need the really bad news to come through? Would you still use the sandwich technique? I mean, you could. It's just kind of an open question. Yes?
Sandwich technique as an end of maybe giving the bad news, but saying I'm hopeful that we can turn this around and work together, something like that.
Okay, so you could use it maybe in a different twist, where maybe instead of ending on, here's something else you did great, end on, hopefully we can turn this around, or here's some steps you can take to improve, or looking towards a positive future goal. So maybe tweaking the sandwich technique. What about thinking about different types of trainees? When you think about the types of mentees you've had, are there certain mentees who might really respond well or need kind of a sandwich technique sort of a situation, and others where perhaps they might need more direct feedback? Any thoughts on that? Okay, it depends on your relationship with the person. Okay. So balancing. So I'll put balancing positives and negatives. And so that kind of idea is important to consider. You can ignore my typos. And also considering that, there's not one right way to do it. It depends on your own style, on how your particular mentee or mentor mentee responds to things, and also how your relationship is developed over time. I put avoid distractions. So avoid distractions could also go under avoid this, could be distractions. So some of these are kind of the flip side of each other. Let's see. So other things. So what about, so this scenario also seems to suggest that this mentor and mentee have kind of a long-standing relationship. Like this isn't their first interaction. This mentee didn't come in kind of disgruntled and disconnected. So what does this say about how the relationship might have looked over time? It looks like it's a pattern. How does that pattern get started? How do you set off on the right foot to have good communication with the mentee? And I asked another question after you raised your hand, so you don't have to answer that question. What was your comment? Regular assessment of how things are going? Okay, so getting feedback from the mentee about how they think things are going and providing that feedback to them as well. Okay. And how do you establish effective communication from the beginning? Okay, so talking about the style of communication that person prefers, the style of supervision, maybe the frequency, or how direct even how people handle critiques, maybe having an open conversation about that from the beginning. Does anyone use mentoring compacts with their mentees? How many people do? Just to raise a show of hands. Only one? And do you use that after the mentor sessions? So one of the things we really emphasize in the workshop, if you decide to do that in the future, is the use of mentoring compacts. And these can be very useful in setting the stage from the beginning about your expectations of the mentee and what they can expect from you. And I've started using one of these since I started leading these mentor workshops. I started using one of these several years ago, and I found it to be really, really essential. If you do the mentoring workshop, we give out examples of these, and you can use those to tailor them to make your own. And there are also different examples online you can find. But I found this over time as different situations have arisen. I've added more content to it so that it helps with problems down the road. And it sets a foundation from the beginning where if you have problems later, you can come back to that and say, well, see, I said that if you have roadblocks or this or that you should come to me, and here's the best way to contact me, and here's how frequently I prefer to meet, and those sorts of things. So laying those out from the beginning. Okay, so let's see. Just close this out. And that segues in very well to our next activity we'll do, which is a communication styles inventory. So someone commented that understanding how your mentee communicates and prefers to communicate is important, and also understanding your own communication style is important. So there will be handouts going around, and once you get those, I'll give you some instructions. Okay, so as you get these, there will be 4 columns, X, Z, W, and Y. And for each row, circle 2 words circle a word in 2 of the columns. So for each row, 1 through 15, you should circle 2 words that you believe best describe yourself. Sure. So, and it's written on here too. But so for each row, so you go down number 1. There's 4 words across the row: disputes the issue, unruffled, focused, and sociable. For those 4 words, select 2 of them that you think best describe you, and circle 2 out of the 4, and do that for each of the 15 rows. Okay, I think most people are still selecting their answers. When you do get to the end on line 15, then you're going to sum the number you've circled for each column, so the number of X's, the number of Z's, the number of W's, and the number of Y's. Okay, and when you're ready, you're going to transfer your answers to this grid. Now, the tricky part is you're going to make a square and not a kite, or a rectangle and not a kite. So as you transfer each of your answers to the grid, so you're going to put what number you got on W, X, Y, and Z. Oh, these are coming around. So you'll put your number on each of the grid lines, but then instead of connecting them like a kite, like a diamond shape, you want to draw a straight line out from each one so that it creates a rectangle. Okay, and has this third sheet gone around? Oh, not this one. Okay. Has this one gone around? So depending on how your rectangle falls, some people will find that they're very balanced between these 4 quadrants. Other people will fall very heavily in one quadrant or another, or have 2 that are predominant for them. This sheet will tell you what your answers might tell you about your own communication style and how you tend to respond under situations of stress. Okay, and now I'd like you to all get into groups of 3 or 4 and discuss what your inventory looks like. Discuss whether you think this validates how you see yourself, or whether there's any new information here or things you disagree with. And also discuss how having information like this about your mentee might alter or guide your mentorship approach. Okay, so groups of 3 or 4, you probably need to turn around to create groups around the tables. Discuss what your grids look like, whether you think those validate or give you new information, and how they might guide your mentoring approach. Okay, and first question, so to what extent did the results of this little test, this little quiz, validate what you already know about yourself or give you new information? Did this pretty much fit with how you see yourselves? I asked a yes or no question. So one of the rules of communication should be don't ask yes or no questions. So what are your thoughts about this using this sort of an assessment in a mentoring setting? Wow. What quadrant were you in?
Now I wish I had the 7. I'm very heavily in the doing side, which is interesting because we had a grand rounds 2 weeks ago about this sort of thing, and we were all split into 4 groups based on a very similar battery.
Ah.
And we ended up in the competitive group. So
Oh.
there's a lot of correlation.
Okay. So how do you think that might mesh if you have a mentee who's more in the thinking or the collaborating quadrant, for example?
We'll find out. No, I'm not trying to be funny. I have a brand new research associate. I've worked with some med students in my lab over the past 3 summers who have been very similar to me, so it's gone very well. But this is very helpful because going forward, I'm sure not everyone I work with is going to be.
Okay. So could you see a place for using an assessment, maybe not this exact one, but assessment similar to this or this one with your mentees, just to kind of have a discussion about where you're coming from? I am also very much in the doing quadrant. And so when I have one-on-one meetings or lab meetings, I always like to end with bullet points and have an agenda. And so I'm very aware about that about myself, and that I can get frustrated if things kind of are meandering or going off course. And that sort of thing might be important for some aspects in terms of people with the creating or collaborating or thinking side of things. So being aware of those aspects can really help. Does anyone use any sort of an assessment with their mentees to get to know about their personality or their style in any way? No one currently does. I like the Strengths Finders. I use Strengths Finders with all of my new undergrad trainees and graduate students and postdocs, and it's a really good way to, when we have a start of a new year, everybody does Strengths Finders, and we come into the first lab meeting and talk about what their top strengths are and how those might affect the way they approach their work. It's a little different than just pure communication, but it gives us an idea of people's priorities and what's important to them and what kind of drives and motivates them And that's been an interesting way to get to know people. So that's something to consider. Okay, so any other thoughts about this sort of inventory, or did anybody think it was completely off base and didn't describe them? Well, you answered all the questions, so it probably should describe you since you were the one answering it. So that's probably fits pretty well. So for our last thing, I'd like you to pair off into pairs of 2, which would be a pair, and think back to that initial feedback that that interaction that we read through at the beginning. And one of you be the mentor and one of you be the mentee, and work through and act out that sort of a scenario. And when you're playing the mentee, you can be as difficult or as easy as you'd like. You can be very non-responsive or however you want to play it. And as the mentor, see what you can do to adapt to that mentee and to make that interaction go as smoothly as possible, with the goal being to elicit change and collaboration with your mentee. Okay, so find a partner, and we'll do that for the next about 5 minutes. Okay, so hopefully you were all able to resolve all of your mentoring issues with your mentee. And so just one final plug for our mentoring workshops that we do, which is we do offer them about once or twice a year. And they're very discussion-based and really interactive, and every time I've led them, there's new things that come out, and I'm always learning things myself during them. It's a little harder to have a real discussion format in a group this large, but when we have groups of 15 or 20, it's always very lively and interesting discussion. People bring real-life issues that they have and real-life examples, and it's always really informative. We had a recent very senior mentor who wrote us a letter after the completing the recent workshop and said, he really thought it was going to be a waste of his time. He's been mentoring forever and thought, well, I'll go sit through this because he was required to as part of a training grant he was on. But he really was one of the most engaged people and had such interesting comments to add. And at the end of it, he said, that it was much more useful than he thought it would be, and that he would really recommend it highly. So regardless of stage, people really have a lot to contribute to the groups and a lot to get from the groups. And so I encourage you to look into that if you'd like to continue to enhance your mentoring skills, or if you need to say that you're going to, for example, be a mentor on a training grant. It could be something useful to add to say that you're going to add that to your own training experiences. Okay, well, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.